Okay, so for the big ideas to be on the lookout for today, what are trophic levels, autotrophs, heterotrophs, producers, primary, secondary, or tertiary consumers, decomposers? Okay, what are all of those? How much energy passes from one trophic level to the next? And what's the difference between a food chain and a food web? Okay, so all living things require energy to perform the functions necessary for life, right? Think about everything you need to do to stay alive, right? Well, you need to eat, but you can't eat without lifting the food to your mouth. That takes energy, right? Especially if you were actually having to hunt for your food, that takes energy, definitely. But even more than that, just breathing, right? That takes energy. It's movement, it's the motion of your lungs. That is energy being used up. It uses energy to breathe, right? And your food, as it digests through your body, all of that takes energy, all those processes. Blood circulating through your body, your heart pumping, that all takes energy. The warmth that you need to not freeze to death, that's energy. Heat is energy, right? In fact, that's actually where most of your food goes to, believe it or not, is keeping you warm. Okay, where do we get our energy? Well, from food, right? Your breakfast lets you get through the day. Okay, more specifically, it's chemical energy in the food that you eat, and now it's your chemical energy. Okay, so the thing about energy is it can never be created or destroyed, but it can change forms, right? The law of conservation of energy, that's actually called, right? So when you eat the food, you're not destroying the energy in the food. You're changing it to now energy that you're going to use, and you're going to use it for a bunch of different things. Most of it, like we said, is going to go to heating you up, but some of it is for breathing, some of it is for pumping your heart. So energy is never destroyed or created in an ecosystem, but it does change where it is. So in most, plants capture solar energy from the sun, right? And then they convert it into chemical energy. Sugar, okay, glucose is how they do that, which they can then use for growth and for cellular functions, right? Growing takes energy. But now that that chemical energy is in the plant, well, other organisms can get it by eating the plant. So this fact kind of leads us to the idea that all energy in an ecosystem, including the energy you're using right now to just read this sentence, right, came from the sun, right? We can trace all energy back to the sun. So why do we know it always goes back to the sun? Well, every living thing does something called cellular respiration. You might remember that from Science 10. What is that? We take the stored chemical energy in glucose and then we use it for life functions. So wiggle your fingers. Right now, what's happening to allow you to do that is cellular respiration. This reaction right here. Glucose is reacting with oxygen to make carbon dioxide and water, and more importantly, the energy that you need to do it, right? Now, every single living thing does that, okay? Only some organisms, though, can make this glucose that is needed to do cellular respiration. So only some organisms can take energy directly from the sun and make their own glucose. This is a process called photosynthesis. Photosynthesis, so photo means light, synthesis means making. So photosynthesis literally means making with light, right? Making food with light. Okay. So if an organism cannot do photosynthesis, like you and me, right, we cannot go sit out in the sun and start to get full. Doesn't work that way. But we need this glucose to do cellular respiration, to do everything that's required to keep us alive. So what are we forced to do? Well, we have to eat something that has glucose. Okay. Now it might be the plant that made it itself, or it might be something that ate the plant, or it might be something that ate the something that ate the plant, or on and on, right? So if an organism cannot do photosynthesis, it must get its glucose by eating another organism. Okay, so basically, the number of steps you have to go away from the sun to get to an organism is that organism's trophic level. So the first thing, the thing that makes its glucose directly from the sun, that would be the first trophic level. The thing that eats that is the second trophic level. The thing that eats that is the third. The thing that eats that is the fourth. Troph means energy. Okay, so at the first trophic level, we have things called autotrophs or producers. Okay, now, like the name producers suggests, they can produce their own chemical energy. They can make their own glucose. Okay, they're called producers. That part makes sense. They produce their own food. Auto means do it yourself, right? We said troph means energy. Auto basically means you can do it yourself. And like we said, troph means energy, right? So since they are the first step from the sun, producers make up the first trophic level. Now, producers are at the base of Every food chain. You will never have a food chain without producers. Why? They're the only ones that can turn the sun's energy into chemical energy. You cannot do that. You cannot sit outside and get full from the sun. That sun's energy is useless to us. However, producers, autotrophs, can take the sun's energy and turn it into food energy, into glucose. Okay, so how do we repay them? By eating them, right? They provide this energy to everything else in the ecosystem by being eaten. So, what kinds of things can be producers? Well, plants are the first one that pops to mind, but there's also algae and bacteria that can do this. Okay, there's photosynthetic bacteria, but anything that can do photosynthesis is a producer. This is just a reminder of the general equation of photosynthesis. You basically take CO2 and water and you make glucose and oxygen. You may have noticed cellular respiration is just photosynthesis backwards, basically, right? So only producers can do photosynthesis. Everything, including producers, does cellular respiration. That's where we get the energy we need to live. You might be thinking, hey, but there's like caves and stuff where there's living stuff and no sunlight. And you're right. So for almost all ecosystems, the sun is the origin of the energy, okay? But there are some where things can do chemosynthesis. So chemo means chemical, and synthesis still means making. Now, the producers in these ecosystems are little bacteria that can actually take chemicals like methane and they can turn those into glucose, right? Sugar, energy, chemical energy. But for most, it's this stuff, it's photosynthesis. Okay, now something comes along and eats the producer. At the second trophic level and higher, depending on how many times something has eaten something, okay, we have what are called heterotrophs or consumers. Okay, consumers, that makes sense. They consume other things. So a consumer heterotroph is an organism that can't produce its own energy, so it must get its energy by eating other organisms. Eating, consuming. Okay. Also, that word hetero, that means different, something else. It gets it from something different. It gets its energy from somewhere different, unlike autotroph, where you can get it from yourself. So there are all kinds of consumers. There's herbivores, those are plant eaters, right? Carnivores, animal eaters only. Omnivores, which eat plants and animals, right? We are omnivores. Well, not all of us. Some of us are herbivores, okay? Detrivores eat dead things. So you can probably guess by now, vor means eat, right? And you'd be right. Okay, and then the beginning parts, herb means plant, carn means meat, omni means everything, detra means dead. All right, so the first organism that consumes the producer is called the primary consumer. So looking at the example down here, we have the sun. Okay, we usually don't include the sun, but it could be there. The first thing we have is the producer, right? The producer takes energy from the sun, turns it into glucose. The first thing that eats it is the primary consumer, okay? And I'm also going to add in the trophic levels. So yes, it's the producer. It's also the first trophic level, okay? The first thing to eat the producer is the primary consumer, right? Primary school is the first school you go to. Also the second trophic level, okay? The thing that eats the thing that ate the producer, in other words, the thing that eats the primary consumer, is then called the secondary consumer. Now, which trophic level do you think we're at? And then the thing that eats the thing that ate the thing that ate the producer, right? In other words, the thing that eats the secondary consumer, we call the tertiary consumer. Usually above that, we just say it's all tertiary. So if something were to come along and eat this owl now, we would still just call that thing a tertiary consumer. We really do primary, secondary, and then kind of call everything above that tertiary. Okay, and that would be the fourth trophic. Okay, and something could eat the owl and it would be the fifth trophic level, but we would still call it the tertiary consumer. From now on, it's all tertiary consumers. Okay, so the sun is not really a trophic level. It's just showing where the energy came from in the beginning. There's another important energy role in an ecosystem. We don't really give it a trophic level, but it does play an important role. Okay, so decomposers are things that break down complex organic molecules. So molecules in things that were living. Okay, remember we talked about these when we talked about fossilization. Break down complex organic molecules into simpler molecules, and that's where they get their energy. So by breaking down waste and dead stuff, they turn it into nutrients. Okay, so they take this dead stuff and break it down into the nutrients that are needed by the other stuff in the ecosystem. Okay, so they're like recyclers. They take this old dead stuff that's just sitting there doing nobody any good, and they turn it back into nutrients that can now be used again. Important to note, they are not recycling energy, they are recycling matter. Okay, energy can never be Energy is not recycled. We always need the sun there. So now they can be used again, but the matter, the nutrients, right, those can be recycled. Okay. Decomposers are essential for this stuff. Without them, ecosystems would run out of the materials that support life as they got used up by other organisms, right? Right? If they're not being recycled by these decomposers, then eventually everything just runs out if it's all stuck inside all this dead stuff that got it but is now dead. Mostly they're things like fungi and bacteria, but insects and stuff too can act as decomposers. So just a quick look here at the laws of thermodynamics, how they apply to an ecosystem. Remember, energy cannot be created or destroyed, but it can be transferred from one form to another. 99% of energy on Earth available for living organisms comes from the sun. Energy in the biosphere is not recycled. It flows in one direction. So you cannot recycle energy. The energy that is coming out of you right now as heat, that's gone. Try and get it back. You can't, right? It's been used, it's over. So it's gone for you. How are you going to get it back? Well, you're not going to get that energy back, but you can get more energy by eating some more food later, right? So that means energy must constantly be renewed by the sun. If the sun ever goes away, right? Besides us all freezing to death, yes, but even if we were somehow to survive that, we would run out of energy, right? The plants would not be able to do photosynthesis anymore, meaning there would be no way to get glucose for chemical energy for us to use. Now, the second law of thermodynamics talks about how some energy is converted into unusable energy or is lost as heat. Okay, in other words, no energy transformation is ever 100% efficient. So imagine when you eat something. Do you think the thing that you're eating, let's say you're eating a strawberry, okay? Do you think that strawberry, when it was doing photosynthesis, it was producing sugar, it says, oh boy, I really hope someone's going to get to eat me and use all of this chemical energy that I'm making, right? No, it wasn't. It wasn't thinking about you. It wasn't wanting to get eaten. It was using that energy for its own life functions. Now, you kind of cut its plan short by eating it, but it was using that energy. Most of the energy that that strawberry had in it was already used up by the time you came along and ate it. So most of the energy a consumer gets from their food source has been either used up by the organism or it's just lost as waste energy, waste heat. Like I said, actually the main thing your food does is keep you warm. That's where most of your energy goes to. So ecologists follow a general 10% rule that a consumer only obtains 10% of the usable energy from their food source, which means 90% of it is lost as waste energy. Okay, so 10% is another way of saying 1/10, right? So essentially, as you go from one level to the next, divide by 10, and that's how much of the energy will actually get passed on. So you are a blueberry plant that has just converted solar energy into 5 million kilojoules of chemical energy through photosynthesis. Oh no, you've been eaten by a mouse. Oh no, the mouse has been eaten by a fox. And oh no, the fox has been eaten by a wolf. So of the 5 million kilojoules of energy that started out that the plant got from the sun, how many did the mouse, fox, and wolf receive? So to find 10% of a number, divide it by 10. Or you could think of it as just drop a zero, right? So from the 5 million kilojoules that were in the blueberry plant, the mouse will get 10% of that. So divide by 10 or just drop off a zero. So now, right, one less zero. There were 6, now there's 5. That's how many kilojoules the mouse will get. What will the fox get when it eats the mouse? Drop another zero, right? So it only gets 50,000. And then when the wolf eats the fox, it'll get 10% of that. So drop another zero, divide it by 10 again. So it's only going to get 5,000 kilojoules. That is the 10% rule. So a useful thing is to be able to represent this flow of energy in the ecosystem, okay? Remember, every living thing needs energy to survive and to reproduce, okay? Producers can make their own glucose. Consumers can only get it by eating other organisms. In this way, the energy flows from organism to organism within an ecosystem, and it's just passed on as one organism eats another, right? You eat it, you get its chemical energy. So there's a few ways we can represent it. One is a food chain. So a food chain is a very simple way of representing it. You've probably seen them before. It represents just one possible pathway that energy might take through an ecosystem, okay? So this does not mean this happens every single time, but it is one pathway that energy could take. Arrows show, this is important to know, arrows show the direction and pathway of energy flow. They show the pathway of energy flow, okay? Students often say, oh, it shows who's eating who. Not really. It's showing where the energy is going. That's what the arrow is. That is energy, okay? It's saying energy goes from the algae to the mosquito larva, okay? So there's just a couple there. Notice what's always at the beginning? A producer, right? They're the only ones that can take the sun's energy and actually turn it into chemical food energy. And then we always go primary, secondary, tertiary consumer. Primary, secondary, tertiary consumer. What trophic level is each one? Well, first, right? Second, third, fourth trophic level. Okay, try this. Pause the video, draw a food chain of your own, include and label the producer and a primary, secondary, and tertiary consumer. So have them in there and label them. All right. Now you could probably guess from this that, okay, sure, this could happen, but I mean, something besides a mosquito larvae probably eats the algae too, and something besides a dragonfly larvae probably eats the mosquito larvae, right? And there's tons of fish probably, so it's not like this is the only energy flow that happens, right? And you'd be right to think that. So although food chains can show us drills and trophic levels of some organisms, obviously in most ecosystems, many food chains are happening and they overlap, and organisms can have different roles within them. Okay. So when we start to put many possible pathways of energy, we start to build a food web by putting many food chains together. Okay. This is a much more realistic representation of the many ways that energy might flow through an ecosystem, right? Because of course, there's many ways this could happen, right? So first things first, can you find the producer? Ah, there it is. Now it's algae. Now you could be from a different planet and have no idea what algae was and still say that was the producer. How? Well, notice how all energy is leaving the algae. It's the source of all energy in this food web, right? And so that makes it the producer, right? It's where everything can trace back its energy to. So notice you can just pick one and call that a food chain, right? That could just be a food chain. We're just putting a whole bunch of food chains together into a food web. This is a food chain: algae, tadpole, frog, right? Algae, mosquito larvae, dragonfly larvae, two giant water bug, right? Totally valid food chain. Put them all together, you get a food web. So it's asking us to label the following energy roles on the picture above. So an autotroph. Okay, autotroph, what's that another word for? That's another word for a producer, you're right, okay? So algae, that is since we said all energy is coming from it ultimately, right? Everyone traces their energy back to the algae, that is the producer. The tertiary consumer. So to be a tertiary consumer, right, you have to eat the secondary consumer, right? Which means you need to eat the thing that ate the thing that ate the producer. Okay, a little confusing. So we just have to go enough steps away. So the snail is a primary consumer. The northern pike is a secondary consumer. Uh-oh, on that food chain, we don't have a tertiary consumer. That can happen, right? What about if we go from the algae? Okay, mosquito larvae is primary consumer, which makes, oh, this looks good. The dragonfly larvae is a secondary, right? And then the bird here is a tertiary. Okay, there we go. So in that food chain, right, that one there, that possible pathway that energy could take, this bird here is the tertiary consumer. Now, I'll challenge you, can you find another one? In fact, you could probably notice, look, that giant water bug would be tertiary, right? If we follow that pathway. Or if we go this pathway, the stickleback would be. Okay. Notice too that you can be more than one thing. You can fill in at multiple trophic levels. For example, what we just said, if the algae goes this, if we follow this one, right, we have producer, primary consumer, and this stickleback becomes a secondary consumer. But what if we go this way? Producer, primary, secondary, tertiary. So the stickleback can exist at more than one trophic level. It can be a secondary and a tertiary consumer. It can probably even be a primary consumer. I'm sure it eats some algae, okay? It can't be a producer though. And what about decomposers? Well, everything gets decomposed, right? Everything's going to die eventually. So some algae will die without ever getting eaten, and it will get decomposed. Some snails will die and get decomposed. Even our tertiary consumers eventually will die and will get decomposed. So all dead organisms go down here to the fungi and the bacteria to get decomposed. And so another thing that food webs do a really good job of conveying that I want to show to you is the interconnectedness of the whole ecosystem, right? It's all kind of in a pretty delicate balance where everything has a role. Remember, like we saw in the video with the wolves and the river, right? It really is a web, right? Where everything's connected, and a change in one population can have effects that we would never really even consider. There's no such thing as just changing one population in an ecosystem, right? Food webs show us that. If we change one, it's going to have a domino effect. It's going to affect other populations as well because everyone's depending on each other, either to control their population by eating them, or to support their population by being food for them, right? So this question here just kind of gets us to think about that a bit. So if the dragonfly larvae population were to be wiped out by a pesticide that specifically targets them, what would be the initial effect on? Okay, so first let's just think about this. So with our food web, we can kind of now trace all the organisms that are going to be affected by this. Truthfully, probably all of them are a little bit, okay? But let's say now there's no dragonfly larvae, okay? Well, it asks, first of all, what's going to happen to the grebe population, right? These birds here. Well, what did they just lose? They just lost a food source, right? So if there's less food for these guys, then a lower population of them will be able to be supported. So that would cause their population to decrease, like we saw in the predator prey, right? That's what it is. It's a predator losing some prey, so its population is going to drop. What would happen to the mosquito larvae population? Well, the mosquito larvae population are a prey to the dragonfly larvae, right? They eat them. So if they have fewer predators, then their population is going to go up, right? So there will be more mosquito larvae because there'll be less dragonfly larvae to eat them. So increase. And then finally to the algae population. So this starts to show, right, how you can have effects not just below you and just above you in a food chain, but kind of a few steps away. And realistically, probably all throughout this food web, if we remove the dragonfly larvae, there would be some effects. So now let's look at what would happen to the algae. Well, we just said that the mosquito larvae would increase, right? And what do the mosquito larvae do? They eat the algae. So if there's more things eating the algae, more mosquito larvae, then the algae population will actually decrease because we removed the dragonfly larvae. This third unaffected option, that will pretty much never be the right answer to a question like this. There will always pretty much be an effect of removing an organism from a food web. The other thing that we can kind of get a sense for here, remember how we said biodiversity was very helpful in an ecosystem? Well, you can kind of see why here now, right? Because we have a whole bunch of different types of species and populations, if we remove the dragonfly larvae, yes, it's probably going to have an effect, but over time, this ecosystem might be able to balance itself back out again because there are other organisms that can step into the role that the dragonfly larvae filled. For example, the frog, yes, it'll lose those. So initially, the frog population probably will go down, but it might get back to an equilibrium a little bit easier because there's tadpoles that now their population can increase. Mosquito larvae, maybe their population will increase, and the frog hopefully will still be able to find enough food, right? The stickleback lost some food, but again, more mosquito larvae, right? And the grebe, if the dragonfly larvae were its only source of food, the grebe would be out of luck, but thankfully there are giant water bugs and leeches that are also filling that role. So removing the dragonfly larvae would be damaging to the ecosystem. I'm not saying it's fine to just do it, but you see the benefit of biodiversity here, right? Other things can step into the role that the dragonfly larvae filled in case something were to happen to the dragonfly larvae. Now compare that to a food chain. If this were the biodiversity of the ecosystem, right? If there was not a high biodiversity, well, now what happens if let's say the grasshopper got removed? Well, the yellow warbler is going to die off completely. There's no one else to fill the role of the grasshopper for the yellow warbler, right? And then if the yellow warbler is dying off, the peregrine falcon is going to die off. So if our ecosystem were this low of biodiversity, now truthfully, this is a unrealistically low biodiversity, right? But you see the strength that comes with having a high biodiversity. If there's only just a few strands holding your food web together, then it's very delicate, it's very fragile. If it's a complex web with a whole bunch of diverse organisms, then losing one of those webs is a little bit easier to overcome and to find a new equilibrium. Okay, so hopefully you're able to pull these out now. What are trophic levels, autotrophs, heterotrophs, producers, consumers, primary, secondary, tertiary consumers, decomposers, how much energy passes from one trophic level to the next, and what's the difference between food chains and food webs? Okay, if you're looking for practice with this stuff, try out the topic 2 section of the practice assignment for the week.